Ladies and gentlemen, I bid you a very warm aloha and welcome from Honolulu in Hawaii. My name is Dr. Alfred Oles. I'm a professor at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. On behalf of our partners, the Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs and Pacific Forum, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our APR-SAF 29 side event, Accelerating Asia Pacific Space Economies through Partnerships, Challenges, Opportunities, and Best Practices. I'm delighted to see such a large audience joining us today, and not only from the Asia Pacific, but around the world. Thank you for making the time. I especially would like to recognize our alumni among the audience. It's so good to see our Ohana again. A very warm welcome to you. And last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to acknowledge the untiring help and support of the APR-SAF Secretariat. We are deeply grateful to this dedicated group for providing us a platform to exchange our perspectives. Now, ladies and gentlemen, our topic today is both timely and consequential. It is highly encouraging to see the emergence of space economies across a wider range of Asia-Pacific nations. We can now distinguish a spectrum of space economies at differing levels of maturity and engage in an increasingly diverse range of space activities. There appear to be expanding opportunities to harness complementarities to grow partnerships that will synergize the space sector in the Asia-Pacific. But yet, ladies and gentlemen, it appears we haven't fully seized these opportunities to realize our potential. And this side event will be an opportunity to explore why this might be the case. What might be some factors inhibiting intra-regional Asia-Pacific partnerships? What best practices in business or policy might help strengthen the growth of space partnerships? And where do we see standout examples of partnership that can serve to illuminate our way forward and also to inspire us to greater things? We hope discussions today will provide some answers that will be helpful to you as you navigate some of these issues yourselves, but also as we together seek to grow the Asia-Pacific space economy. To help us, we've brought together some of the foremost leaders in the space field. Helping us with keynote remarks will be Brigadier General Jesse Morehouse from United States Space Command. Moderated by Mark Mannington from Pacific Forum, our expert panelists will then take us through some of the finer points in Asia-Pacific space partnering. Dr. Malcolm Davis from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Dr. Namrata Goswami, an independent analyst based in the United States, Mr. Craig McGilvray from Lockheed Space, and last but not least, Mr. Sam Wilson from Aerospace Corporation in Washington, D.C. Finally, we will then conclude our discussions with incisive observations from Dr. Christy Gavella from the Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs at the University of Hawaii. Now for Jesse, Mark, Malcolm, Namrata, Craig, Sam, and Christy, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise and your insights. As always, I'm humbled by your generosity and I'm deeply indebted for your time. Now, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, it is my greatest pleasure now to hand you over to our keynote speaker, who from his unique military experience interfacing with civil and commercial space, but also his global perspective from his command roles in United States Space Command, he will help guide our thinking around the topic at hand. So it's my greatest pleasure right now to introduce Brigadier General Jesse Morehouse. Once again, General Morehouse, a very warm welcome to you, and the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone, and or whatever time it happens to be, wherever you're joining us from. And especially to Dr. Ohlers, thanks again for having me, and to Dr. Gavella as well. I must say it's a real honor every year to be invited back to speak at ARPASAF. This is my third year in a row doing it, and as I told my boss, I said, either I haven't gotten it right and they're asking me to come back and try again, or hopefully I'm able to contribute something. But it's awful humbling to be invited back because of the quality of the panelists who will follow me, and I hope in some small way to be able to contribute to their discussion, which is always the highlight of the event for me, which is listening to the panelists who come after me talk. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and get started. So as Dr. Ohlers mentioned, I am one of the deputy directors for plans, policy, and strategy at United States Space Command. And one of my focuses is on building international partnerships to ensure that space remains safe, secure, and sustainable, and presents opportunities to us all. So from that perspective, and one of the things that really interested me about the topic for the forum this year is the idea of accelerating economies and really focused on opportunities. And so I'm going to focus my remarks on what I think some of the opportunities are in when you're talking about space economies right now. And it's interesting. When I first started working in military space operations, space was pretty boring. There would be a few launches every year. It was easy to memorize the few constellations that were on orbit. I think we used to have multiple choice tests about the number of constellations on orbit, and you couldn't get away with that today, as you all know. And so I could go through the numbers, but we all know how space is growing exponentially. And when you look at where those satellites are coming from, they're coming from the commercial sector. And with SATCOM, of course, satellite communications being the lead, but many other areas that used to be exclusively the realm of governments has become not only commercial, but financially successful commercial ventures. And what's fascinating is when you look at the future and you see the discussions people have for the future, there's thinking, as you all know, that there will never be another government-sponsored international space station like project that commercial entities will lead the way for whatever comes next after the ISS, and that's just incredible to think about. So we're in this period of time when all of the ways we used to look at space are changing, and so a lot of the thinking of old guys like me isn't as applicable as it used to be, and we've really had to learn a new way of looking at the world, and which is something that I really like. I enjoy change. I embrace it. And when you look at how the world is changing, how do you, as leaders in government organizations, whether they're military, whether they're civil, how do you, as a commercial leader in space operations in a company, how do you look at the world and try to shape those opportunities that you can realize? And there's a big difference between aspirational goals and platitudes, and how you actually realize your objectives in this fast and very different environment that's quite different than what we all grew up with. So what I'm going to focus my remarks on is the role of strategy, and how space strategy is a really important concept that we need to stay focused on. And then I'm going to talk about a little bit about some of the a few of the foundational capabilities that I think are the most important for countries to consider, and that offer real opportunities for collaboration. And so those are kind of going to be the two keys, the two themes I'm going to talk about. So let me start with national space strategies. When you look at the world today, and you look at nations who are interested in space, and I use that term deliberately because there are nations who should think about a space strategy who don't have anything in space, but they might rely on space for disaster relief, law enforcement, military operations, or just ensuring that their populations are able to fully leverage the capabilities available in the modern world. There's many different levels of reliance on space, but if you're here listening to this talk, it's probably a good bet that you feel that you have some level of national interest in space. And so one of the things that's really interesting is watching nations as they start to articulate their first national space strategies, or as they revise space strategies for the first time in a number of years. And I'm just going to use a couple examples, and I'm not going to use the United States as an example, because I think it's interesting to look at what some other nations are doing right now. And the key theme here with national space strategy, I think, is that this is the time, if there ever was a time, to invest in a strategy and policy refresh. Just because the opportunities are shifting, and if you do not set up that stable and predictable environment, it'll be very hard for everyone, military, civil, commercial, to really innovate and start to realize the opportunities that are available now and in the future in the space domain. So, national space strategy, what can it look like? I think that I'd like to start with India's national space strategy, and it's a wonderful document. It's only about 11 pages long. It's an easy read. It focuses on articulating what the desired end states are, the objectives that India is focused on, and then it goes through and it articulates the responsibilities of a number of organizations within the Indian government that are tasked with setting the conditions for success across the government and the private sector. And one of the things I like about brevity, which is something that anyone who works for me has come to understand as a pet peeve of mine, is that you can get your message across really quick. You can also really focus people on what the key things are. When you make a document too long and too involved, sometimes it tries to be all things for all people, and it's hard to focus your resources. And I think that India does a great job of providing guidance to these subordinate organizations within the government, and everyone understands what they're supposed to do. And it also makes it very clear that the goal is providing that stability and predictability. And it's very hard, I think, for especially the commercial sector to realize opportunities if they don't have that stability and predictability from the government. One thing, and I throw this out there as an observation for maybe somewhere where it would be great to see a nation like India possibly consider some modifications when they go back and look at this policy again. And this is true across many national space policies that I looked at, is there's not a lot of discussion in them given to the role of foreign companies. And I think that no one nation has a monopoly on space expertise. there's a number of nations, or I'm sorry, there's a number of countries and other nations that have amassed years of engineering expertise in certain areas. And I think that when nations don't consider how to leverage that expertise, it makes it hard for those companies to understand how to go to another nation and engage with companies within that nation sometimes. And there's a big opportunity cost there. Now, that of course has to be balanced. No nation wants to be import knowledge, but not have the ability to grow that knowledge within its own population. So clearly there's a balance there. But I think that clearly articulating the role for foreign companies is a very important part of the strategic considerations for how to really jumpstart your space industry. Now, shifting gears to the UK's national space strategy, one of the things here that I'd like to kind of compare and contrast is the UK space strategy is quite long. And not only is it a very long document, it's also nested within a number of other national policies, such as the National Innovation Policy and a few other policies as well. And so it makes for a more complex read. And there's pros and cons to that. One of the things about the UK strategy that I really like is that they try to articulate some of the pillars, some strategic pillars that are common to another number of space strategies that I read, but I kind of like the UK's way of looking at it. Their four pillars are developing resilient space capabilities and services, growing the UK as a science and technology superpower, collaborating internationally, and unlocking growth in the space sector. And the unlocking growth in the space sector is one of the ones that I thought was the most interesting. As I expand on it, it talks about encouraging space innovation. And these are all the words that you see in many space strategies. But the thing here that I thought was really interesting is they explicitly call out guiding innovation towards areas that they feel are the greatest need for them. So it's somewhat unique in that it details that deliberate focus on guiding the efforts of all these different parts of the space enterprise, of their domestic space enterprise, if you will, towards the things that they feel are the most unique or the most important to them. Now, so kind of two different ways of looking at what a space strategy might look like, and there's clearly many others, but I figured with the time I have available, I'd focus on those two, just because I thought that they highlighted some of the key things to think about. Now, what's interesting is once again, I want to just go back to this idea of national space strategies are for the most part very focused on national interests, but they overall they don't talk much about collaboration, and they mention it some. You'll see it here and there, but the one disconnect that I saw is when you look at those national policies and then you look at what's actually being done, a lot of these countries are actually involved in a lot of collaboration, at least at the government level. And one example of this, I'd like to go back to India, and I'm going to use this opportunity because I'm the first speaker to congratulate India on getting to the South Pole of the moon, the lunar South Pole, which is I'm sure everybody was watching with bated breath and very excited and proud of their accomplishment when they landed the Chandrayaan-3 here in the thing that's interesting to me, though, about it is not so much the actual successful landing, but the fact that the Chandrayaan spacecraft were actually, that was number 3. So India, as part of their strategy, in their exploration strategy, Chandrayaan-1 was conducted a reconnaissance in the MIP mission to the lunar surface, and then Chandrayaan-2, of course, didn't work. But that didn't stop them, and Chandrayaan-3 was first rover to explore a polar region of the moon, which is just the long-term vision is really exciting there. But one of the things that's really interesting is that when you look at Chandrayaan-1, it had payloads on it from at least 3 other nations, from the US, from the ESA, and from Bulgaria as well. So not only did they collaborate as far as payloads went, but what they also did is they shared their findings freely and openly with the international space community. And when you think about it, they were the first ones to discover hints of water at the South Pole. And even with sharing that information, they were also the first ones to actually get on the ground and have the chance to look at that themselves with Chandrayaan-3. So I love the collaborative nature, and I love the fact that sharing for the good of everyone. And I think that there's some real lessons there that would that I think it would be great to see if some of those lessons from how we're actually conducting some of these space missions makes it back into our strategy in a aspirational type of way. So just for consideration, anyway. The one other thing that I wanted to mention here when we're talking about national level strategies is we're fortunate at United States Space Command to have a number of liaison or exchange officers from other nations who collaborate with us on our coalition operations. And recently we were joined by Colonel Toshidi Ajiki from Japan, from the Japanese Defense Force, and he had a couple of interesting thoughts from a recent conversation I had with him, really focused on what he felt were foundational capabilities, and how as nations develop foundational space capabilities, deliberately finding ways to collaborate with other nations is a very important consideration, in a way that helps you really begin to develop those capabilities at a faster pace. And one of the observations he brought up when we were talking about this was how important it is to share a nation's needs with each other, which is kind of risky. And when you talk about inhibitors, one of the things that we always think about in the United States is we'd like to share our thoughts on what capabilities other nations might want to bring to the table to collaborate with us on, with regards to some type of collaborative endeavor we might be interested in pursuing with them. But at the same time, there is a risk in that. When you tell someone, when one nation tells another that it would be great if they brought a certain space capability with them, that implies that you don't have it and that you have a problem there. So it's how do you do that in a way that helps inform other nations so they can develop a value proposition for coalition approaches to space that doesn't also broadcast potential or perceived weaknesses or vulnerabilities for a nation. And I think it's a very important consideration. I think that one of the key ways to address that is developing trust. And the more we're able to develop trust between different coalition partners, the easier this becomes. And what it really has to be is not a person-to-person type of trust, but it really has to be an organizational level trust, where you know that as people come and go, that you know what to expect of the organization. The organization is predictable and transparent to its partners. So just something to think about there. And I think it's a real important consideration when you look at how to address some of these inhibitors. Now, shifting gears slightly, I think that, and actually, let me wrap up my thoughts on national space strategies with a framework that I present for thinking about articulating space strategies. And it's something that I've written down, which is as you develop a national space strategy and you think what should be in it, or you're looking at refreshing your space strategy if you have an existing one, or you're talking with government officials and encouraging them to do so, what are the things that you want to have and that you should be thinking about? And I think that the first thing that you want to talk about is what must be a sovereign capability. And this will vary from nation to nation, but that idea of what can you not do without that you must have on your worst day as a nation? What are those sovereign capabilities that you must have? And then and that's informed by a lot of things. Clearly, resources will inform that decision, and you might not be able to get everything you want, but I think it should be a very informed decision, and it should be clearly articulated. The next thing is, what would you rely on a coalition for? What are you comfortable relying on a coalition for, or with external partners for? And then, what must you rely on the commercial world for, in the form of contracted services? And I think that this is one of the more interesting roles to explore in the future, because I think that the commercial sector presents huge opportunities, but we're also understanding as nations how to work with commercial space companies. And if you've been following some of the Starlink successes and concerns in Ukraine, I think that that's a example that should inform the thinking of many nations with regards to what does your relationship with commercial space providers look like. And I think that there's some really good lessons to be learned there that are broadly applicable. And then finally, or actually two more things, is one is, how do you leverage academia? And I think this is the part where there's the old saying about the difference between giving someone a fish and teaching them how to fish, is when you look at how do you encourage the growth of space experts within your own nation and amongst your own population. And the last one is some type of initiative or idea of how you support academia with a very focused STEM plan to make sure that you're providing the right talent at the university level that can be leveraged for building your own space industry. So those are kind of my closing thoughts on what a space strategy probably wants to address. And then the last thing I want to talk about just briefly is some of what types of capabilities are we talking about that these space strategies might be addressing. And I'm going to focus on a couple military space capabilities, because that's what I'm focused on. And I just say it's a pretty simple list, but you really you have to make sure you have some type of space situational awareness, or SSA for short, also sometimes called space domain awareness, and making sure that you are thinking through how do you maintain that the appropriate level of understanding of what's going on in the domain, whether that's through sovereign capabilities, contracted capabilities, what have you, whatever seems to make the most sense. And then the other thing, SATCOM remains in its various forms the most important space-based capability. How do you make sure that you know what's if there's any interference with your SATCOM, and how do you attribute it is very important. And then becoming more important is the idea of domain awareness, and that really allows nations to conduct more informed disaster response, law enforcement, military operations, many different things like that. And typically these types of constellations are expensive. They typically are best employed in low Earth orbit. So it ends up being a global capability, regardless of whether you want it to be or not. And so I think that it really lends itself to lots of opportunities for collaboration or providing those services to others when those satellites aren't overhead. And so I think that there's a lot of interesting considerations there. And then the last one I'd mention is launch, which is interesting. There's a number of different perspectives on launch, and I find it a fascinating subject to listen to experts on. The one thing, though, that I think is really important is that the Asia-Pacific has some very key geography when it comes to launch locations near the equator, and developing those capabilities, such as I know Indonesia, for example, currently has a suborbital launch complex that is, I think, half a degree from the equator. When you think about the opportunities of some of these with a lot of water and around for safety, and when you start thinking about what some of these opportunities could present, possibly from a sovereign perspective, but maybe from a regional perspective or a coalition perspective, I think that there's a lot of real interesting opportunities to explore there. And so with that, I just take it back to the idea that this is definitely the time to invest in a policy refresh and a space strategy refresh. There's a lot of different ways to do it. I think it's interesting to look at what some of the nations who have recently refreshed their national space strategies have done. And there's definitely some inspiring work and hard work that's been done by many nations in that realm. But I think that space is just moving so fast that there's a lot of room to rethink and reimagine some of this, and to figure out how do you really set that transparent and predictable ecosystem within which you can find innovation and opportunities going forward. So with that, I would like to thank you again for your time, and I hope that you found some of these thoughts interesting, and I look forward, as always, to hearing how the panel goes with this discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, General Morehouse, for those wide-ranging remarks, helping us contextualize and think about the broader ramifications of the topic that we're dealing with, taking us from a really high strategic level and prioritization of strategy and partnerships as well, through maybe to more nitty-gritty details as to how do we actually conduct our partnership development here. And it's interesting to hear you draw parallels between coalition building and the development of partnerships, because it does actually boil down to that one common ingredient, as you highlighted, the element of trust. And it's good to hear that word again, but it's something that probably is challenging to get at, and we might seek some wisdom from our panelists as we go forward. Speaking of whom, our panelists, we're going to be helped, ladies and gentlemen, with now moderation of the panel by Mr. Mark Manhattan from Pacific Forum. It is my great pleasure now to hand over to Mark as he will guide us through the discussion there, and perhaps give us an insight into what is to come. Over to you, Mark. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Aloha, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Again, welcome to the Accelerating Asia-Pacific Space Economies Through Partnerships, Challenges, Opportunities, and Best Practices, a virtual side event of the 29th Asia-Pacific Regional Space Agency Forum. I'm Mark Manhattan, as Al mentioned, Director of Cybersecurity and critical technologies at the Pacific Forum. There's so many ideas and insights that needs to be unpacked. In echoing General Morehouse remarks, let me just summarize a couple of those points. I think it was very made apparent that we need novel ways of thinking about space policy and how nation states as well as the commercial sector are really at this inflection point of redefining what is collaboration in this very exciting and emerging space or domain, if I was to call it that way. We have seen a proliferation of national space strategy and how governments are not the only actor anymore, leading in the front lines of developing new space technologies. And we also heard about the need for better coordination between national governments and homegrown commercial sectors, and how each sector could capitalize on these opportunities that are on horizon. But also, we noted that there is a disconnect between policy and practice, and what collaboration in this area would look like, especially from the viewpoint of the government. One interesting point that was raised by General Morehouse is the need to develop trust, not just within government entities, but also with commercial sector partners. And if I will push the point further, I think another issue on the horizon is this question of sustainability. As nation states go and explore space as potential source of rare earth minerals, particularly here in Southeast Asia, I think it points to a question of how do we make space exploration sustainable. I would also like to put into the table the implications of artificial intelligence and somehow how it would facilitate or also inhibit sort of space collaboration among nation states, as all the buzz on ChatGPT for sure will have its effect in developing space technologies. And lastly, General Morehouse talked about trust, developing coalition building. But also, I think we should also be mindful of how do we make space technologies and space cooperation more inclusive. Today, we are joined by 4 distinguished speakers who will further unpack the current state of Asia-Pacific space partnerships and collaborations from complementary yet distinct perspectives. Our panel will harness these ideas of partnerships and how governments and commercial sectors, as well as academia, synergize collaboration, and what concrete steps can we take to make these aspirations a reality. This roundtable session will help us better understand various factors that can facilitate or inhibit intra-Asia-Pacific partnerships. We shall also attempt to highlight some of the best practices in government, academia, and industry that could help foster collaboration that can contribute to the strengthening of space economies in the region. First, let me briefly introduce our esteemed panel of experts. Dr. Malcolm Davis is Senior Analyst in Defense Strategy and Capability at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Canberra. Dr. Namrata Goswami is an author, professor, and consultant specializing in space policy, international relations, and ethnic identity. We are also joined by Mr. Craig McGilvray, Asia Managing Director, Space Lockheed Martin. And last and certainly not the least, we have Robert Sam Wilson, Senior Policy Analyst, Center for Space Policy and Strategy at the Aerospace Corporation of the United States of America. So let me kick off the session with you, Namrata. How would you assess the current state of intra-Asia-Pacific space partnerships and collaborations? What do you see are the opportunities and prospects of collaboration over the horizon?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be back again. And I think this is a really critical topic. So to answer your question, what do I see are the possibilities of intra-regional cooperation, for example? And by that, I mean the Asia-Pacific. So there are certain interesting developments that have happened in the last few years. General Morehouse, of course, talked about nations putting out their space policy and strategy. So one collaboration in terms of the narrative that I'm seeing is that major spacefaring nations in the Asia-Pacific are starting to talk about space, not just from an exploration and science perspective, but also from a resources perspective. So we see this, for example, let's talk about India's space policy document. the document for the first time, and for a country like India, this is a really strategic development, points out that India's policy will support the extraction of space resources if an Indian citizen or a non-governmental entity is able to do that. We have China also talking about very similar concepts. Very recently, Wang Wei, who's an academician at the China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, put out a roadmap for looking at space from a resources perspective. The vision is to develop a complete level of industrial scaling up to about 2100. And then what is interesting is that a country like Japan is also the first Asian nation to actually institute a space regulation in December of 2021 that supports space mining for their company. And we saw iSpace attempt to do that in April of this year. So first, there is a narrative developing that is going to push for collaboration. Now, collaboration might happen in a way that would see certain strategic alignments also happening. So while we talk about intra-regional collaboration, we also see the development of collaboration with external actors out of the region. So if I mean it from a geographic point of view, so India just signed the Artemis Accord, as you know, as a signatory that is has the capability now to go to the moon. So you have that developing. Now, the second important level of collaboration that I see happening much faster than state-level collaboration, state to state, is commercial. So almost all the nations in Asia are rising up to the prospects of commercialization of space. The Indian Space Policy Document 2023 is interesting to me and groundbreaking to a large extent. I've been studying the Indian space program for a very long time, and including China. I saw commercialization and the push for it both in China, Japan. I saw that conversation happening in the ASEAN nations, for example. Indonesia talked about it. You had Singapore that is interested in such a commercialization of services in terms of space. But the Indian Space Policy Document went further. So what it pointed out is that for the first time, a nation like India that is so dependent on state-funded and state-organized manufacturing, building of launch systems, end-to-end space capability, is going to completely commercialize it. So this is a complete departure. And what that means is that Indian space companies now, which has grown from 4 in 2014 to 150 today, which is a huge exponential rise, is going to now vie for the commercial partnerships and markets. And that will also encourage collaborations within the region and outside. So commercial viability, the importance of pushing for commercial sector. Japan has taken decisions to push its commercial industry as well. So I see collaboration happening at that time in that particular context. Now, and finally, I'll end by saying that what is also so interesting to me in terms of just collaboration between Asian nations is that what is something distinct about the Asia-Pacific is this reticence to put out space visions. So we do know that the US conceived of the Apollo program and pushed for landing on the moon for humans for a very long time. The Soviet Union had very high aspirational goals, which they succeeded in sending the first human to space and the first satellite. But what is interesting today is that that reticence is moving away. So recently, China put out a document called Document 60, which talks about how China is going to scale up its space resources and commercialization. Very bold in terms of its white paper as to what it wants: space resources, planetary defense, separate military service, build collaboration through their own International Lunar Research Organization. This is not something that China did during the Cold War. So this is a very new development. And then what is also interesting is that India, which also was always very shy to give you numbers as to what it's going to do in the next 20 years, it would give you numbers for the next 5 years. Recently, the Indian Minister for Science and Technology, as part of the G20 summit, there is a summit which happens along with it called the Science 20 Summit. He pointed out that the aspiration for India by 2040 is to contribute $40 billion to the global space economy from $8 billion today. So the aspirations are really interesting. What does that do? And I'll end there. So what that has done is that given the success of China, given the success of Japan, given the success of India very recently, landing on the South Pole, the conversation in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations is starting to get exciting as well. So there is a lot of opinion pieces, and in my conversations with colleagues there, what they're arguing is that it is really critical for nations in Asia, especially from those, for example, in Southeast Asia, to come together within the forum of ASEAN to build an ASEAN space agency so that they can pool their resources and use models, for example, the Indian low-cost model, to build space capability. So you can see that narrative, commercialization, and finally aspiration is leading to a desire to build collaborative efforts, for example, in ASEAN. I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Thanks, Namrata. I think that's a very, very interesting opening remarks for our session, and looking at how the intensity of nation states right now, as you've mentioned about laying out their vision. India, of course, when we were organizing this event, there was just such an excitement with the recent breakthrough that the Indian space industry has achieved. And also here in Southeast Asia, I'm currently sitting in Kuala Lumpur and came from Jakarta, and I could really feel that a lot of interest in ASEAN with regard to using space technology for resource extraction and also exploration. And I've heard from colleagues that they've started to really interact with their counterparts in other jurisdictions in the region, such as Japan, of course, India, as well as the United States. I'll move on. Thank you so much. We'll get back to so many of those points you've mentioned, but I'll move on to Malcolm. All this talk about collaboration, partnerships, and all that, but what are the challenges that you see, Malcolm, that may inhibit intra-Asia Pacific partnerships, given this intensity and excitement in the Asia Pacific region and all things space?
Well, thanks for having me. Look, I think some of the challenges are pretty obvious. The first, I think, is China. How do we manage that elephant in the room, or the dragon in the room, I should really say, in terms of the rise of China and China's ambitions and aspirations in space? I don't see states engaging with China in the same way that they engage in a manner that Namrata just laid out, and for good reason, because I think that states are aware of China's Made in 2025 1,000 Talents plan, whereby they take the technology that they gain access to through international cooperation and then militarize it and use it to enhance their military capability. So there's a natural constraint there in terms of us being able to work with China in space. And I think the obvious problem is, China is a strategic competitor, a strategic adversary. And they are developing their own space capabilities that are by and large driven by military interests and needs. But they also have this broader, very high-level astro-strategic ambition for a space economy that is moon-centric, that is cislunar-centric, where they seek to acquire and access lunar resources and ultimately control those lunar resources. And I think more and more states are aware of this sort of grand Chinese astro-strategic ambition, and it makes cooperation with Beijing really, really difficult because China is being seen to act against the spirit of regional cooperation. I think the other, besides putting China aside, and it's very difficult to do that, but putting China aside, I think the other challenge is that Indo-Pacific space actors, including my own, Australia, are relatively new. Obviously, India and Japan have been involved in this for some time, but others are relatively new, and so we are still finding our feet. Classic example for Australia, of course, is that we made very rapid progress under the previous government with the establishment of the Australian Space Agency in 2018, the move swiftly towards satellite manufacturing, the establishment of a growing launch capacity, which I think we're probably about maybe 18 to 24 months away from the first launch of an Australian satellite on an Australian launch vehicle from an Australian launch site. So we've made some really rapid progress. But space is still political in many respects. And now we have a government that's maybe taking a bit more of a cautious perspective on space. They've just cancelled a major Earth observations satellite project called NSMEO, National Space Mission for Earth Observation, that has set back confidence in the industry to a fair degree. So when we talk about cooperation between countries, we have to take into account the politics of that cooperation. And that's much more complex than simply the technical aspects of space cooperation, the technology and so forth, or even the legal and the regulatory side of things. There's internal politics and domestic politics that do play a role. But I think that those challenges aside, I think, as Namrata said, we have huge potential opportunities to play for here in terms of not just cooperating on satellites in low Earth orbit to GEO, but the potential opportunities for space resource utilization, the ability to exploit the cislunar environment. The Artemis Accords, I think, are a huge step forward, and that is the reason why so many countries have signed up to them. So I do think that the opportunities are there, the incentive is there to cooperate, to work together, because we realize that space is complex. It's still expensive, although the cost of accessing space and using space is dropping dramatically since the days of Apollo. So I think that there will be real opportunities for cooperation within the Indo-Pacific region between Australia and Japan, Australia and India, Australia and South Korea, for example. And of course, ASEAN is now also a rising actor in space as well, as Namrata suggested. So I think that the benefits are there, but this big challenge of how China manages its activities in space, perhaps in cooperation with Russia, and the internal politics of the region, I think are also important. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. Do you see any space I mean, what would it take to create that space for collaboration with China? Because I think a lot of the developments coming in from China and a lot in the region are also very interested to see and echo the message of development and resource extraction. What would it take for countries such as the United States and other like-minded partners to work with China? Because it's definitely we hear about collaboration, cooperation. So what would potentially a practical demonstration of collaboration or factors that could somehow create those at least minimum conditions for collaboration with China?
Well, look, I think as a starting point, China would need to sign up to the Artemis Accords and honor those accords, and we'd need to work with Beijing, and they would need to work with us on how we responsibly and sustainably manage lunar resources. And there would need to be a firm and strict regime in place to make sure that states do not claim territory on or around the moon. And I think that's the first point. So that's a legal and regulatory aspect, which clearly is a long way away from being resolved. But I think that the reality is that we are in an era of major power strategic competition that extends across all domains, including into the domain of space. China has its grand strategic ambitions that it ultimately wants to become the dominant actor in the Indo-Pacific region. It wants basically a China dream whereby China is rejuvenated and brought back to the place that it feels that it should be, which is a new Middle Kingdom. And that is at the expense of the United States and its allies. And so that's the geostrategic reality that we face. And that geostrategic reality extends into an astrostrategic reality of competition in space for space resources that includes, contested space and the development of Chinese counter space capabilities. So I see, the potential for cooperation with China to be a very long way off indeed. I don't think we should assume that somehow we can separate the civilian side of or the commercial side of space from the government and defense side of space. I think in China, the two are intermixed.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. I think that's a perfect segue to Craig, who's from the private sector. Hearing all these perspectives from our first two speakers. How does the private sector perceive the current state of cooperation or lack of cooperation potentially from the viewpoint of the commercial sector, who has been pushing the latest innovation in this emerging space?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. It's always hard when you don't go first, because you already have a plan on what you're going to say, and now I'm going to have to change some of it. But look, I'd just like to thank Dr. Ole, Dr. Govella for the invitation, Brigadier General Morehouse for his opening comments. A lot of that resonated with everything that's going on within the region, as well as Dr. Goswami, and also what Dr. Davis just said. I think with the private sector, the adoption for new technology, the adoption for collaboration, and the speed, I think you could have it into three areas. One is speed, agility, and risk tolerance, far different to that of government and commercial if you split the two. Because the private sector, at the end of the day, likes to take first mover advantage, and first mover advantage means profit, right? The private sector is all about generating profit at the end of the day. So they're more adaptable to, taking up new technologies, applying them, and just seeing if they work. If you have a look at the private sector within Asia Pacific, especially commercial, they were first early adopters of commercial satellites. So PT Telecom, Measat, Korea Telecom, way before government services came onto the satellite space, they'd already sort of invested and took the risk and and provided services to the country, commercially. I think when you talk about sort of collaboration from the private sector to the government sector, one of the biggest advantages there is around accelerating development and capability. And if you take Asia Pacific, there is different countries are at different space maturity levels, and the goals of those countries differ from civil, commercial, and military. So, from Japan to Thailand, completely different aspects, right? India and Korea, very similar industrialization policies where they want to foster indigenous capability, which sometimes halters the ability for international markets to collaborate. So I think, with what Brigadier General Morehouse mentioned about policy, it does change, and it does affect how private sector collaborates with government, but it's different, and collaboration can be different and have different terminologies when you consider, the G2G aspects with Chandrayaan satellites, right? So, I think when we go through sort of the private sector ability to be more speed, they can speed to market, their ability and the ability to take risk. You need to take also into account, especially from the private sector, is the indigenous development capability and enhancement of local industry, because that's what's important. Each country wants to develop its own capability. And so therefore, there is some hesitance sometimes on collaboration, because international collaboration is often viewed as, we'll just give it to you and then you'll be fine, and then you'll have that capability. But it does change. Some are more open, some are more not, and I think it's up to us as the private sector to really understand what that indigenous capability roadmap is, to see where the points of collaboration are, and I mean true points of collaboration, where the private sector and the government sector are trying to solve the same problem, right? Whether it's whether it's using phased array technology, or whether it's on the military side with hypersonics, or whether it's on Earth observation, hyperspectral. Like, there are so many different elements. But what are the problems that we're trying to solve? I think once the private sector understands what the government's trying to do and the problems it's trying to solve, then there's true pathways to collaboration. But again, because each country in Asia Pacific are at different space maturity levels, it can often have some roadblocks, or the path of collaboration takes a lot longer. So, I think some of the best practices you could learn from the private sector is, there's a greater risk tolerance to new technology and adopting them. the agility to adapt new technology, and as well as risk. Failure is not necessarily a bad thing commercially. I think there are, means of mitigation that the private sector use, such as in space insurance, for example, which, many governments don't use, right? So, the ability to then go again becomes a lot easier than having to go back to the government and ask for a new round of funding. So I think there's a number of things there that I think governments could leverage on the private sector, especially when it comes to accelerating development, accelerating Indigenous development and Indigenous capability from country to country. And so, as larger companies that sort of are looking at in collaborating into Asia, we mustn't look at it we mustn't look at it as if we're creating a future competitor. What we're doing is actually creating, future supply chain, mitigating our own risk, which therefore, if we can drop that barrier, I think there is a lot more collaborative efforts that can be made that will actually sort of speed up the development, with the private sector and the government sector alike, and in both in the military side, civil side, and the commercial side. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you so much, Greg. How are you currently navigating the space industry in particular, from your viewpoint from Lockheed Martin, the current space of the current environment of collaboration, given the conditions that Malcolm and Namrata has laid out in terms of particularly on the current geostrategic or geopolitical environment, where we know for a fact that technology collaboration rests on a vibrant and vast network of research and development, investments and all that. So how do you, from your perspective in your company, navigate this very, very complex environment at the moment where all of us wants to collaborate, but the reality is the terrain is not as conducive as we want it to be, like, especially from the private sector, who, as you mentioned, is very, very much, of course, looking at the KPIs and profit margins.
Yeah. So for us, what we don't want to do is impact Indigenous development, right? What we don't want to do is there is a technical roadmap that most countries have that they want to follow, right? And from our sector, we can't be interrupters, right? We can't interrupt that process, right? A country must be allowed to sort of go through its own technology development. Where we come in is, where can we accelerate it that doesn't impact, right? So where can we accelerate Indigenous development that doesn't impact its own pathway, but yet at the end, when they finish, they aren't 2 generations behind, right? It may be a generation, or they're up to next generation. Because, depending on the sector that you're looking at, right? If you look at the military sector, right, you want the allies to be close to par to where you are from a technical standpoint. But you need to recognize the importance of Indigenous capability and Indigenous development. Because if you don't, then there's nothing. You're always just going to hit a roadblock. So, it's consultation, right? It's understanding what their technology roadmap is. And sometimes there isn't a path to play, and we just need to accept that and look at other areas. But we spend a lot of time, country to country, understanding what these technology roadmaps are and what the country's Indigenous development goals are. Where do they want to get to? Where do they want to be? And how can we assist? And it may not be a technology play. It may be an education. It may be creating centers of excellence that allows us to share, education from an educational perspective to help with the development. Doesn't necessarily need to be a product per se.
Well, that's really great to hear, because as you said, the space maturity of each country would also determine their appetite to participate and also potentially further governments to invest. Sam, you've been nodding your head, and I'll turn to you. And we'd be curious to know if you could cite concrete examples to build on Craig's remarks about collaboration in the Asia Pacific that you think stand out in terms of successful case studies as sort of examples of collaboration from a public-private partnership vantage point?
Great, thanks, Mark, and thanks, Mark and Al and Christy for putting this on and for inviting me. I did this last year and it was a lot of fun also with Malcolm and Namrata. And it also followed General Morehouse last year, and I thought, General Morehouse, thank you again for really insightful comments to start this off. And it's an honor to be on a panel with industry leaders and first-rate thinkers. Okay, so I'll kind of answer your question in two parts. One is on the public-private partnerships, or kind of more generally, how countries are thinking about partnerships, how governments are thinking about partnerships with industry. I think building on what Namrata started off with, we're seeing a lot of interest in the region from the government side in building out their space industries, building out their space sectors. And I think part of this is all the reasons that other folks have talked about so far. And that's really important right now, because over the last few years, we've seen VC investment drop precipitously. And so, companies are really caring a lot more about revenue than investment. And so, I think you have this real prospect for countries, for governments that want to have a thriving commercial space sector. If they really want this, they might have to pay for it, right? Or at least shoulder some of the costs in the near term. And what we're seeing is that countries are willing to do that, right? Like, this is so important that we're willing to eat this cost and try to help our industry at this time when investment is low. So you're seeing things like, so I'll offer one country as an example, South Korea, because I recently had a paper on South Korea, so South Korea is kind of fresh in my mind. But just looking at South Korea, they have several public-private partnerships between their national research university, KAIST, and several private entities, including Hanwha and KAI, the Korean aerospace industries. They have one thing that South Korea is doing is transferring technologies that were government developed to the private sector, and this is a big focus. And this includes things like Nori, their big space launcher, which was heralded last year. It was the first time that South Korea had launched and deployed a satellite into orbit using its own domestically built rocket rather than one that was built by South Korea and Russia. And then from 2020 to 2022, we've seen their budget for promoting and building out their space industry double, right? So it's really significant steps. And they have big ambitions. This year, they released their space policy plan, and they want to increase their share of global space sales from 1% to 10%. So really big, and that's by 2045. I should get that. So big ambitions, and they're taking real steps. And South Korea is just one example, right? Like, you're seeing that across the region. The other part of your question that I'll answer a little bit differently is thinking on the government side. So one potential partnership that I'm really excited about is Japan and South Korea. I gave a talk in Seoul last October at a conference, and my talk was about how, from a U.S. perspective, Japan and South Korea were really attractive countries to focus on to bolster defense-based ties. That these countries both had a lot of potential, that we should be doing more with our security space activity. And a Korean discussant responded to my talk, and he said, I think you should go further than what you're saying. I think we need to be doing things trilaterally in the security space side, right? Like, we need to be doing things trilaterally for defense-based activity, defense-based cooperation. And I thought, wow, that would be terrific, but how likely is it? And sure enough, a year passes, and you have this trilateral summit a few weeks ago at Camp David, and the official statement out of the trilateral summit said that the countries, among other things, were going to further dialogue on space security cooperation, and thinking about threats to the domain. So, this is, I think, really encouraging. If you look at Japan and South Korea, they're two of the biggest spenders on space. They both have electro-optical imagery and radar satellites. They both have space situational awareness capabilities, or they're developing sophisticated space situational awareness capabilities. And they're two of 6 nations that either have their own position, navigation, timing satellites, or developing their own position, navigation, timing satellites, right? So there's a lot of potential, a lot of opportunity for shared, for a partnership that if we could achieve interoperability, if we could achieve integration, right, like that could build out their architectures in ways that I think would be really promising. And from a U.S. perspective, right, this is super exciting, because one of the things that we want to do is try to get allies and partners to build out their industries, build out their space capabilities, and make them interoperable with our architectures, right? And make them integrated with our architectures. And that's a great way to achieve some of the things that we're still trying to do with commercial space, when we're trying to leverage commercial space. And I agree exactly with what Craig said, that's a need, right? To kind of leverage things that exist on the commercial side. So again, this notion of South Korean, Japanese partnership in space is more aspirational than concrete, but I think that could be changing, and there's just tremendous upside here if it were to change.
Great prospects. Yeah, great prospects indeed for collaboration. Before I go for another rounds of questions to each our speaker, Craig, Malcolm, Namrata, is there any, or Sam as well, is there anything that stood out from the other speakers that would you like to comment on or provide feedback, or give your thoughts and expand further on your earlier remarks? Now is the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, I think I would like to build a little bit on Malcolm's remarks and also Sam's and Craig's fantastic contribution in terms of how private sector, what it looks for. I think one point that Craig mentioned, which is very critical, is that while you have in global private space industry that wants to collaborate, you do not want to replace the indigenous capability. I think that's critical when you think about the Asia Pacific, because the collaboration has to happen in that manner. Now, when I think about what Malcolm said in terms of the challenge of China, and can we think about collaborating with China vis-a-vis, let's take, for example, the moon. I think as I see it being drawn out today, China has clearly articulated an alternate strategic alignment, the International Lunar Research Station. Russia is a partner. Venezuela joined in, and Pakistan has said that they are interested in joining. So very clear in terms of the strategic alignment and differences. And as we remember, Russia was very much against the Artemis Accord when it first came out. And in fact, if you look at Russia's space policy, and as General Morehouse very aptly pointed out, the different strategies and policies, Russia's space policy is a lot about national security and very low on commercialization. And in fact, I've made this argument in interviews I gave after the Luna 25 crash, that one of the reasons that I could think about as to why Russia has fallen so much behind is this lack of incentive for its own commercial sector to build technology, which, for example, the United States pushed for public-private partnership. And what do we see today? We see innovation in terms of reusable rockets. We see the US building its own indigenous capacity to go to the International Space Station. I'll finally end by saying that the Luna 25 crash had a deep impact on narratives that we hear from the Cold War that countries like China and India are so dependent on Russian technology for the development of their space capability. That completely busted that myth. China landed on the far side of the moon in 2019, landed on Mars, and communicated back successfully. The Soviet Union had never done that. India landed successfully on the South Pole, building on indigenous capacity. What does that do for the Asia-Pacific in a large extent, despite this geopolitical alignment? It builds confidence. It builds confidence in terms of funding. So one of the questions I got asked again and again after India landed is, how was it possible to build this capability with such low cost budget, right? So that's another great insight we get, that with the scaling up of space commercialization, innovation, policy that pushes for building institutions, funding comes in, and you're also able to do it at a much lower budget. And I'll end by saying that I have been a little bit disappointed in Australia. So Australia had a very good vision. When I was there last year, I looked at the vision. They had a long vision in terms of building space capability till 2030, 35. And now they seem to be scaling it back, cutting budgets. In an era where space is such a critical component of geopolitics and your critical infrastructure. So I'm going to end there, and maybe Malcolm has some insights into that as well.
Thanks,
Welcome.
Namrata. Yeah, and you and I both are disappointed with the way things are going in Australia. We've had a change of government. This government basically sees space as the previous government's initiative. So as I was saying in my earlier comments, there's politics involved here. So you have a minister that I think doesn't really see, and I'm talking about the industry, science and technology minister, not the defense minister. You have a minister who doesn't see space as that important. And so he has scaled back key funding. So you've seen the 23-24 federal budget see funding cuts to space. You've seen the cancellation of NSMEO. You've seen the national space policy that was in the works under the previous government now put on hold. And so we lack a national space strategy. So things are slowing down, and the commercial space community and the space policy community outside of government are moving heaven and earth to try and get things back on track. There's no guarantee that we'll succeed, but we're going to do our best because, you know, Australia has huge advantages in terms of launch, given its geography, with the north of Australia being a key location close to the equator from where we can launch, as well as the south of the country being ideal for solar, sun synchronous and polar orbit missions. We have a huge advantage in terms of a high-tech economy, the ability to develop small satellite technologies, to develop commercial space hubs, to work with key international partners, not China, but others, allies and partners. And I think that it would be a terrible shame if the current government essentially hit reverse gear and we end up going back to dependency. And that's what worries me the most, is that we are going to essentially go back to the days of relying on major overseas primes for our key space technology and essentially dependency, which is where we were before the Australian Space Agency was established. The other thing I would say is that the point we're making, I mean, this discussion is all about space cooperation, but there will be situations where we can't cooperate with other states, and China is clearly one of those. Russia is another one, and where they have no desire to cooperate unless it benefits them. So I think that we need to temper our expectation for cooperation, even at the commercial level, with the geopolitical and astropolitical reality that we're in, which is we're in an intensifying period of strategic competition that is only going to get worse, and that's going to extend into the space domain. So we shouldn't assume that somehow we can divorce space, commercial space, or whatever, from that geopolitical reality. We can't.
Craig, any burning thoughts?
Yeah, I need to be careful here. Look, I think different nations have different priorities. They're at different maturity levels. From the security space perspective, you have the Five Eyes. You then have observers to the Five Eyes. There is definite threats that are identified, but they are interpreted differently from country to country. Urgencies change from country to country, whether it's South Korea, Japan, Thailand, or the Philippines for that matter. I think the collaboration with China is a tough one. Not only when Malcolm mentioned, signing the Artemis Accords is one. I think recognizing the ITU is another one. I've been on the other side of the fence trying to coordinate frequencies with China, and their basic method of coordination is at maximum power levels, and you can't coexist. There is none, right? So you have to go and try and do something else. So I think there are some fundamentals out, plus the Artemis Accord that sort of need to be addressed, or we just accept that there are going to be some bad actors, and we as a collaborative, whether if it's 90%, we're all in agreement, then that's 100%. So there are some definite challenges there. I think on the budget perspective, over the last 20 years, from the government perspective, from country to country that I've witnessed, space is the first budget to be cut, unfortunately. It's the easiest budget to cut, and it's the easiest one to repurpose somewhere else, until a country recognizes, well, space is important again. That's just the reality we live. It's not just Australia. I've seen it in South Korea. I've also seen it in Thailand. So, I think that's something that we have to deal with and manage, which is why the private sector is important. The likes of Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, like those developments are so important, because it's those developments that inspire the private sector in other countries to go ahead and do it and not wait. And they're not just doing it just on the commercial; they're also doing it for on military technologies as well. So I think the best thing about working in Asia is that it's so dynamic, and that it changes all the time, and we just have to be agile.
Sam?
Mark, I'll just add on the China front in terms of what needs to happen. I mean, I'll also just add that they need to be able to answer the phone, right? I mean, we're so far from where we need to be. We have our folks at the Combined Space Operations Center in Vandenberg. When they see a conjunction, when they're issuing a conjunction warning, because it looks as if two spacecraft could be within a risk of a conjunction. If they message China, they never hear back, right? Like there's no communication. And maybe somebody's getting that, maybe somebody's not. But that type of the lack of kind of comms that you would need to kind of build towards something just aren't there. And Max Simon from Harvard and I had a paper in Bulletin for Atomic Scientists that was kind of arguing for Russia, how to think about some of the 1980s nuclear conversations and with respect to space security, right? Because those conversations really need to happen. And it's not just about, whether two satellites are at risk of conjunction, but what are the behaviors that are appropriate, right? Like, what are the things that you are going to clearly see as a threat, right? Like those conversations, we aren't having those conversations. There was a space security dialogue with Russia, pre the invasion of Ukraine, but now we're, not talking to them about that either. So that's all kind of distressing, right? Like there's this potential for I think unintended escalation, for not understanding what kind of each other's red lines are, right? And it's going to General Morehouse talked about, we need space domain awareness capabilities. This is like a foundational capability that countries should invest in. We don't have perfect transparency of space, right? So all this kind of, I think, makes it the fog of what a conflict that could exist in space even harder to see through. So anyway, just to add more cynicism to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Sam. I see some questions from the audience in the chat box, and we encourage you all to please start sending your questions. And I'll just throw in this one question to the panel before we go into the very lengthy and very, I think, interesting questions we see in the Q&A. And at least to dispel and sprinkle some optimism for all of us. And this is also echoing General Morehouse's remarks about building trust. And so in this era of geopolitical and geostrategic competition, with the private sector really expanding its influence in all sort of sphere, peripherally or centrally, my question is, how can we build trust? Because at the end of the day, the space is a common domain. And there are countries in the region, particularly in Southeast Asia, that see space not in a very competitive stance, but from a development stance that sort of resonates with countries such as India, to some extent China. But still, the US, Japan, and South Korea are the ones holding top tier technologies on this front. So how can we build trust and sort of create this optimism that indeed collaboration is still possible in this very complex and interesting time in our history? Namrata,
I'll lead off. I mean, we can't build trust right across the spectrum of space activities. That's obvious because, as I said, geopolitics, astropolitics comes into it. I think where we can build trust is with like-minded states, with allies and partners, and also by recognizing the potential opportunities of certain commercial space activities, not just limited to Earth orbit, but out to the moon and beyond, and potentially leveraging the new technologies that are starting to appear that are enabling us to what I would argue we're moving from what Space 2.0, which is the commercialization of space, to Space 3.0, which is large-scale space economies and space manufacturing and resource utilization. So how can we leverage that transition from Space 2.0 to Space 3.0 within a coalition of like-minded states that can work together, that can trust each other, and build that framework up so that it does make it more easy to work together and establish common approaches to the use of space. I don't think we're ever going to be able to work with China or Russia, but we have to recognize that shouldn't stop us from building that collaboration and cooperation amongst other states, and indeed at the commercial level. So that's the way I would do it.
Yeah, I would add that the question as to how do we build trust is not easy given the geopolitical environment, and I'll lay out more concrete examples of why that is. First of all, there is no consensus regarding even an issue like space traffic management, right, between nations. So how do we build even a consensus that there requires to be some kind of global space traffic management, which trust is farther along. First, you have to come to that consensus. Second, is there a possibility of nations, especially those nations that have, for example, anti-satellite weapon capability, to accept some level of responsibility and agree to a moratorium? Those are ways you can build trust, because what happens is that we talk about the concept of trust, but if you have certain activities in space that look adversarial or looks like you are destroying the space environment, nations are watching and societies are watching. And I teach across the globe, and many of my students who come from Asia and Africa are concerned that such activities might destroy that environment for them and their future generation. And then finally, I'll say that if you want to really build trust, one, there has to be a recognition that it cannot be just through space norms. So we talk a lot about space norms. We talk a lot about building a regime that has certain standards of behavior. But what I've heard from developing nations, especially those who critique the European Code of Conduct that was an effort to build some level of understanding, in terms of what should be a code of conduct in space, the developing nations argued that norms can easily be violated. There is no obligation for any nation to agree to or to continue with a particular norm. So if you really want to build trust in a domain like space that has so many multifaceted impact, both civilian, commercial, and especially military, as we have seen in Ukraine and other conflicts, you will need to have certain treaty obligations as well. So, and I'll end with the example. So, for example, there are lots of nations going, for example, to the South Pole of the moon right now. You have India, you have China, which will go next year. You have Russia saying that they will go in 2026 again, for reasons that are not just showing off technology. The strategic importance of the South Pole, we've all heard in the last few weeks. It's where the resources are. We still do not have any kind of treaty that deals with that reality. Our treaty obligations are based on Cold War, a lot of fear about nuclear weapons in space, and disarmament, where we haven't anticipated the world of commercial space that has come along. So we have to first deal with those institutional lacunae, regulatory building up of capability and treaty obligation, to the point that we can actually even think about a concept like trust, is my answer to your question.
Thanks, Anurada. Craig?
I'm just trying to work out how to approach it from a different angle to give a different perspective. You know, I agree, you know, space traffic management, I've been part of a lot of workshops over probably the last sort of 10 years on space traffic management. I think one of the keys, you know, with trust is we've got too many cooks in the kitchen when it comes to space traffic management, because no one will ever agree on who is going to be in charge of it, right? Well, if it's the US, well, then I'm not going to be in charge. If it's the UK, then I'm not going to be in charge. I think the UN has a great framework in which, you know, we could get a lot of people together to agree to establish that setting of rules that not everybody will accept, but most will follow. Because I think by doing it because of what I've said before, that nations are at different maturity levels, and therefore they are more dominant and want to get their point, you know, across, and the way they want to manage it. So, you know, that's one thing. I think the UN has a framework in which I think you could create a base for further discussion around space traffic management. I think, you know, unfortunately, the peaceful use of space treaty is no longer, right? There's a few bad actors that have sort of moved that and changed the focus on that. So when we talk about integrated air and missile defense, it's, you know, we are talking, unfortunately now there's a fourth warfighting domain. You can't ignore that. That is reality. And so that adds further complications, because it's very hard to then bifurcate between civil space exploration and that fourth warfighting, that military side. But because of that, you have seen collaborations now with NASA and Space Command, right? And then you do see collaborations now with JAXA and the JMOD, for example. So, you know, I think, and then also too, you know, Malcolm, I think, you know, the perfect for Australia would be to see the Australian Defence Force and the Australian Space Agency to be more intertwined and be at step, you know, with one another. And then that then forms into sort of the whole allied, and that goes into further collaboration. Like, there are so many tangents you could probably go on in this discussion, and I'll stop it there. But I think there are some fundamentals that we already use now, and I'll go back to the ITU, that could be used as a platform for us to then, you know, work on space traffic management. Because, you know, at the end of the day, at the moment, the hardest thing is to prove anything in space, because we really don't have that precise SSA to determine that if this object was the object that hit, you know, a satellite, for example, right? So, you know, we're far off. And then the only other thing I'll add is the commercial reality, you know, space 1.0, space 2.0, space 3.0. It takes money. a lot of money. And for the private sector, you're looking for investors that are prepared to do it and prepared to stay long term. And at the moment, the financial markets tolerance to things greater than 10, 20 years, there's only a few. So, I think, the long picture looks great, but at some stage, you've got to come back to commercial reality in terms of where the priority sits and what can be accessible now, and then what builds upon that.
Thanks, Greg. Sam, any thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. First of all, I'll be optimistic about the prospects of collaboration and point to this panel. The color coordination is excellent. I count 4 blue blazers, and Namrata's got the blue background, so that worked out pretty well. I go back to an earlier point that Craig made, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, but it was kind of like, partnerships in one sense is going to inhibit partnerships in another sense, right? Like the more that one government is focused on partnering with its industry might preclude it from that industry from partnering more extensively with international commercial, or that government from partnering international commercial, or prevent it from, because it has fewer resources, from going national on certain capabilities or resources, right? So there's all these trade-offs, and not necessarily, some partnerships I think are more valuable than others, but kind of going to this broader question, and again, I agree with Craig that kind of a multilateral approach is a good way for some of these problems to incorporate more nations, including like, what are the behaviors that are appropriate? How can we think about things like space traffic coordination? I won't even say management, right? Because we're not even close to that. But then I'd also just note that like we have made a lot of progress along these lines of countries starting to talk about what are the behaviors that are appropriate. And I appreciate Namrata's point that maybe norms isn't the right way to do it, but still, regardless of getting countries to talk about what are the behaviors that are appropriate, I think is a good first step, because it used to be there's a lot of agreement on the Russian and Chinese proposals of PAROS and PPWT, which was preventing an arms race in outer space, and the prohibition on the placement of weapons in outer space, which were distractions, right? Like, and they still use them. Those countries still use them as distractions. But we didn't have an alternative. It was, well, are you for weapons in space? No, okay, then But that's not what those proposals were about, right? Like those proposals were about something else. And so anyway, partnerships in the right way are really good. And I feel sanguine about the types of partnerships that we're trying to develop. And I think there is real encouragement, from the U.S. side. We're starting to play with this idea of putting active national security payloads on foreign systems, which is really, really cool. And there's a lot of potential. We're going to do that with the Japanese. We're doing that with Norway. So that's really encouraging, and I hope it's an area that we continue to exploit.
Yeah, if I may, I have a quick point to make. So listening to all the panelists, really insightful. So I would say that the one way I think we need to frame our conception of space differently is that we have this narrative that space is somehow going to change all of us. It's this inspirational perspective, right? It's great, but I would argue that if we have a more realistic perspective, that space is not very dissimilar from the other domains. And for example, in air, land, sea, we have been able to come to some level of collaboration when it comes to air traffic control. We have international air traffic in shipping lanes. We at least have our trading systems working, despite the fact that all these domains in times of conflict can also be utilized for military purposes, right? Cyber is an interesting case because with cyber, what has happened is that technology has moved so much forward that regulation and even the ability to understand where a particular attack comes from has yet not been resolved, right? Space is a little bit like that. It's a new domain in a sense that we have been able to get to space in a realistic manner only since 1957. only in the last few years has the possibility that space is going to have this huge level of national satellite constellations, that space is going to be about space resource utilization is becoming more and more credible, right, in terms of technology. For example, building a space-based solar power satellite, China has made it now a national aspiration and policy to do such a thing for dealing with climate change. So in that, I would argue that there is hope that because of nations' incentive structures, this is where I think we need to really think through. When we talk about collaboration and concepts like trust, what is the incentive of states because of what they might lose out if they lose their access to the space domain is what is going to lead to collaboration and building of effort that will keep space secure and safe to use, is my perspective. I push for space to be declared critical infrastructure, including by the United States. China has declared satellite internet as critical infrastructure. So when I say that, I mean, are there certain assets in space that nations need to say are critical infrastructure, vital for their societies to survive? And so there has to be some level of understanding.
So many ideas to unpack right there. But again, definitely agree with designating as a cybersecurity enthusiast myself. I think there's a lot of security implications that comes into play in terms of developing supply chain and risk management framework on space technologies. But I don't want to hug the virtual mic because I think a lot of the conversations and talking points we had dovetails in some of the questions that were raised by our wonderful audience. And I will just lump or sort of categorize their questions into certain sort of buckets. So we can, in the remaining 15 minutes of our time, for all the panelists to respond. And I think I'll start with, since we talked about the cyber and this sort of idea of deterrence, somehow a related concept. There was a question about space deterrence and strategy, and what would it look like, particularly among countries such as China, Russia, Iran, and Pakistan and India, who are for sure have developing differing concepts of space deterrence and strategy. Very quickly, from the question wasn't directed to anybody, but from the panel, if anyone would like to share their thoughts about space deterrence and how does that triangulate, I think, with nuclear as you know, and also cybersecurity, as Namrata has also raised already. Any takers, please?
From an Australian perspective, I mean, we're thinking about space deterrence. We're recognizing that space is a contested domain, that we have to assure access to space. So we're thinking about deterrence through resilience, in the sense that there's a recognition that the more we go down the path of traditional satellite architectures of large satellites in geo and so forth, the more vulnerable we are. So the solution I think we're increasingly going down is proliferated constellations in LEO to make it more difficult for an adversary to take out our space support. At the same time, that actually contributes towards Australia's commercial space sector being able to play a role, because they're better set up to be able to do small satellite manufacture and development and then launch those satellites on Australian launch vehicles than they would, for example, be to launch a large, bus-sized satellite in GEO. Having said that, this government has then just cancelled the Defence Science and Technology's multi-mission Space Starshot, so which was based around small satellite technology. So there's a degree of a logic there which is rather concerning. But I think that we are going down that deterrence through resilience path. We're also thinking much more focused on space control. So there's a number of projects there in terms of how we can do defensive space control. But we've also signed up to the ban on testing of direct descent kinetic kill ASATs, and we're never going to get ASATs in that sense. So I think that we are starting to think about the importance of deterrence in space. We recognize that we can't just assume that we'll always have access to it. We can't just assume that the adversary won't attack our space capabilities. So we have to do more to deter it in cooperation with the US and our other partners.
Yeah, I'll add, so if you listen to General Saltzman from the US Space Force, he makes a very interesting point that the way you can build a resilient deterrent structure, for example, in low Earth orbit, is this concept of proliferated low Earth orbit constellation. So you have so many satellites that it's impossible for adversary to take them all out. So the idea is to scale it up so that you build some level of deterrence capability into the system. And of course, if you listen to India's rationale for why they tested an anti-satellite weapon in 2019 that created 400 pieces of space debris, was that it was a signal of intent. They didn't mention which country, to an adversary, that India has not just counter-strike, but also an ability to counter your systems because you depend on them for your value. So you create a deterrent structure by itself. And then I think finally to signal to nations that you also have other non-kinetic capability. So which is what the United States Force through its doctrinal thinking is signaling, that it's building a resilient force that will have the capability to respond in case US government space assets are targeted. Now, the question that I had for that deterrent structure was that, and this is a question I think I would be so interested to hear insights from the panel as well, that what happens when a commercial satellite is targeted? For example, during the Ukraine conflict, Russia did signal that if Starlink continues to support Ukrainian military force movement, including deployment of missile, they might think of targeting not just non-kinetic, but kinetic. So that question is still out there. So do we extend our deterrence to our commercial assets as well in the United States, for example?
And if that dovetails with your question about how do we declare space assets as like critical national infrastructure as well. I've moved on with a couple of questions on partnership. So I'll assign, because there's just so many comments in the chat box and want to get through all of them. And our wonderful audience have pointed out actors and partnerships that are possible. I'll go back to you, Namrata, on US-India partnerships on space cooperation. Your thoughts? And then I'll go to Malcolm on the potential of the Quad, advancing sort of partnerships in space. We know we have the working group on critical and emerging technologies. And on Craig, and your thoughts about ASEAN. You know, you've talked about Thailand and these small and medium power countries in the developing and emerging economies. Could the private sector help them augment their space capabilities? And what are the opportunities for, as you've mentioned, companies such as Lockheed Martin, you know, provide trainings and consultations for these developing economies to whom their governments are still, you know, trying to find ways to fund their own space, indigenous space capability networks. And Sam, you have the liberty to pick and choose in all those partnerships because your comments cuts across. So we can start first with Namrata on US-India, Malcolm on the Quad, and Craig on ASEAN and developing economies with the private sector, and we'll end with Sam.
Yeah, sure. So if you look at India-US space partnership today, so it took a long time to build to this level. So trust was built. India-US did not enjoy trust at the level they enjoy today during the Cold War. So the process was institutions, educational exchanges, partnership, strategic alignments, threats, opportunities, so all that assessment. So today, when you look at India-US space collaboration, there is this comprehensive strategic partnership that India-US has signed. It includes partnerships in terms of commercial partnerships. It includes partnership in terms of the Artemis Accord. I would say that India signing the Artemis Accord is a big win for United States strategic diplomacy and a win for India. Because India gets access to some amazing technologies, and the US has a partner that is a major democratic nation and with a capability today to go to the moon at a very cost-effective way. India-US has also signed an agreement to send the first Indian citizens to the International Space Station next year, which is, again, very critical geopolitically because Russia is signaling that it wants to exit the International Space Station. And then finally, and those are all civilian, I think of US-India even agreeing to work, for example, on a technology like nuclear propulsion, which is going to be critical for our travel into space. creating the data for understanding space resources, which the Indian rover, for example, is starting to do in the South Pole of the Moon. So I see that kind of collaboration happening. And finally, this is something that was missed in the news cycle, was that for the first time, as part of the comprehensive strategic partnership, Indian officers, military officers will be posted in the Pentagon, where they will actually have joint operational understanding as well across the different domains. So as liaison officers. So those are the kind of partnerships that India and the US has done. But then again, I'll end with this. The partnership, the trust level happened because institutions were put in place, frameworks were put in place, several documents were signed that build up that trust and partnership. And then finally, leaders taking decisions that this is what is good for both the countries.
Yeah, on the Quad, I think there's huge potential with the Quad to be able to do some pretty impressive things in space together. I mean, Namrad has obviously covered the India-US collaboration side of things very well. But obviously Australia, India, Australia, Japan, and then at the Quad level, I think is an obvious next step. There's already Quad discussions on space as a means for sharing information on sort of common problems such as climate change or maritime domain awareness and so forth. But you could certainly expand that out into some Quad approaches to cooperative space missions to the moon, sharing space domain awareness information, space traffic management is an obvious one. Quad, obviously, as an agreement, is not a defensive alliance. It's not a NATO in Asia. And so I think that we wouldn't be necessarily looking to have a Quad military space type discussion. But there are a lot of areas, outside of the military domain that have implications for the military domain that I think that we could look at in terms of the Quad. And certainly, Australia-Japan relationship is really sort of deepening under the reciprocal access agreement. Now got F-35s flying down to Australia to operate from Australia. And so there'd be no reason why we couldn't do something similar at the space level in terms of working with India to sort of work with them in terms of cooperative space missions and take advantage of Australia's good location in terms of space launch, its ability to host ground facilities for space domain awareness and space traffic management, and collaborative research on technology. If we're both serious about going to the moon, India's just put Chandrayaan-3 there. We've got our moon rover going in 2026. Let's actually work together and develop some more sophisticated capabilities that would enable us to do more on the lunar surface. I think that's really important.
Craig?
Yeah, so from the ASEAN perspective, they're compared to, say, Japan and South Korea, but in terms of space aspirations and the budgets that are behind it. But we can't. You have to recognize that Indonesia has Lapan, Thailand has JITSTA. You've got the Taiwan Space Agency who have launched their own satellite Earth observation weather. You have Singapore who are setting themselves up, as a gateway for space, whether it's component, and then you can see the work that Nanjing University is doing here with their CubeSat. So, access to space, these developing countries is actually really cheap because, CubeSats and the availability of launches now to allow these, CubeSats to be flown up, to be operated, to be tested. So I think access to space in developing countries has definitely, improved out of sight. But I think when we get to more strategic investment, it's not the private sector. An example would be with the Japanese government under an ODA facility in the Philippines, giving them access to satellite communications, right? We still have to rely on those other governments and overseas development aid to accelerate that other capability, right? Not just the research capability with CubeSats, that is great, and access to space is better than it's ever been. But that extra layer, you can't rely on the private sector, purely just because of the cost that's involved, and that you would have to rely on overseas development aid for some of those countries in order to sort of accelerate their own capability.
I'll make just 2 points. One kind of tying two related points. One tying to what Namrata said about how the DoD and Space Force are trying to focus on proliferation in lower orbits. We had a budget paper come out recently, and to me, the big story of the defense space budget was just how aggressively we're transitioning, and how much we're pushing and emphasizing higher numbers of satellites at lower altitudes, right? And it's across all missions. It's in missile warning and tracking, which used to always be in high orbits, and that's coming down to MEO and LEO. And so it's really, I think it's a really interesting trend, and it's kind of how Department of Defense has been thinking about resiliency. But it has a really important, I think, really important implication for partnerships, right? Because it used to be we would develop these very small number of exquisite systems in high orbit, and you couldn't do it jointly because, we couldn't trust a country with that capability because it's so precious. But right now, there's a lot more opportunity, and if you're thinking about architectures that aren't 5 satellites but that are 300, there's a role for allies and partners to contribute to those architectures in different ways. And right now I'm writing a paper with a Japanese scholar on how US and Japan could collaborate on space-based missile warning, which isn't really something you could even think of 15 years ago, right? And actually, I saw one of the folks on the call, Yasuhiro Fukushima, who's a real expert on this and has been helpful in the paper. But anyway, I think this is a terribly exciting time for the region, for where space is going to go. And if we get this right, our partnerships on the U.S. defense space side are going to look fundamentally different. The level of activity that we're doing with partners is going to look fundamentally different than it looks now. So hopeful for that.
Thank you so much, Sam. Again, what an electrifying discussion with our panel, Namrata, Malcolm, Craig, and Sam. Again, join me in thanking this powerhouse panel, and we hope that next year we get to do this all in person. Also, thank you as well for the insightful comments, feedback, and questions from our audience. Again, my sincere apologies if we're not able to get through all the questions, but hopefully the insights that were shared by our great panel spark more insights and thinking on space partnerships and opportunities. Now I would like to turn the virtual floor to Dr. Christy Govella, Director of the Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, for the closing remarks. Christy?
So first of all, thank you to all of the speakers who've joined us today. We were really treated by an impressive overview of recent developments in space, which has really helped us to think more deeply about how Asia-Pacific economies can work together to grow their space industries and capabilities. An overarching theme has been that the ways that many countries are looking at space are changing, and our keynote speaker noted it's time for a space strategy and space policy refresh to account for the new dynamics in this domain. In particular, I think we've heard a lot about how the rise and the emergence of new actors in space means the emergence of new potential partners, but also the complication of a lot of dynamics. So the emerging space economies of the region are looking for ways now to advance their capabilities through bilateral, trilateral, and other minilateral and broader partnerships, not only with state actors, but also with private sector actors. And if we think about being as part of the Asia-Pacific Regional Space Agency Forum today, this is a forum that has really made itself a very inclusive forum of public and private sector actors. And this kind of inclusivity has clearly become more important and more relevant over time. Just to sum up briefly, it's really clear that there are so many unexplored opportunities in the space domain. And while some of the countries that we've discussed today are well-established space players, many others are relatively new and still finding their legs, as our panelists noted. So learning from each other's challenges and sharing best practices as we tried to do today is really the key for all of us in moving forward towards our shared goals. And this means sharing needs, sharing capabilities, and sharing concerns, all of which can be actually very risky and difficult to implement in practice. We also talked about a lot of other challenges. Geopolitics and astropolitics at the international level are permeating everything we discussed, including US-China strategic competition. And then there are differences in the ways that countries interpret this geopolitical situation and the way that it impacts potential space policies that they might develop. Moreover, there are domestic politics in every country about space, about how much should be spent on space and what kinds of policies should be put forward. There are tensions between developing indigenous capabilities in individual countries and international cooperation potentially. And throughout the conversation, I think we've heard about space as a domain where economics and security are really fundamentally linked in many ways, which complicates cooperation. We've also heard a lot about institutional weaknesses and questions about norms, rules, and other kinds of structures that might be developed. So how do we move forward? Well, I think we've had a lot of really concrete ideas and points made about what we need to do as next steps. And an overarching theme has been that developing trust among partners is essential but difficult. We also need to think in new ways and engage in policy innovation. We need to not be disruptors, but be accelerators of our own mutual development in space. And we need to understand the differences in things like the speed, agility, and risk tolerance across the private and public sectors. This gives us a really variegated and dynamic environment in which to work. And so we need to give thought to how we build trust and how we build partnerships, because it may be necessary to strategically sequence this kind of cooperation and collaboration to build from smaller to broader levels of partnership. And we need to look for compatibility among and opportunities to harmonize architectures in space. So a point that we can take home is also that thinking about what might be learned from other domains is key, because a lot of these problems are ones that have been faced in other areas, and yet in other areas we've been able to cooperate, although competitive dynamics still exist. So we're really grateful to have been able to pick up on the focus of the Asia-Pacific Regional Space Agency Forum on partnerships this year in this side event, and to have the opportunity to engage in dialogue and to really talk to a broad audience from around the region. I'd like to thank my co-organizers for this event, and this is actually the fourth side event that we've had the pleasure of convening alongside the Asia-Pacific Regional Space Agency Forum. So the University of Hawaii at Manoa Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs is so honored to work with the Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies and Pacific Forum. It seems fitting that an event about partnerships has at its core such an excellent partnership that brings together government, academia, and nonprofit think tanks to tackle really important issues facing the region and the international system. And all of us are based in Hawaii, which also has a very unique contribution to make in terms of bringing countries together at the intersection of East and West, as well as in cultivating space-related research and dialogue. And my final note of thanks goes, of course, to our wonderful audience. You've been incredibly engaged, and we had so many questions in the chat, some of which Mark was able to skillfully weave into the discussion, and others which we hope we'll be able to pursue on a different occasion. So we're happy to be able to bring you these discussions, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you again to everyone for joining us today.